Hello, welcome to the West Rockhill Historical Society Heritage House and Barn Tour. We are pleased to have Jeff Marshall, President of Heritage Conservancy, share his expertise on our historical house and barn.
Hi, I'm Jeff Marshall. I'm the president of Heritage Conservancy and a certified barn guy. So I love old barns. So here we are in West Rockhill in the called the James barn. Right now we're in the bottom of the barn. The Pennsylvania Bank barn was a two-level barn. The upper level, which we'll see later, has got the threshing floor and the hay storage. And the lower level was used for stabling. And if you look carefully, you can tell that this barn was designed for horses at one side and cows on the other. It's a little bit of a subtle thing, but I will point out a couple things that show that we are now in the horse side. 95% of the time, the horse side is the side of the barn closest to the house, because obviously you ride your horses to town, you don't ride your cows, you don't need to get to them for that purpose. But when you look around on your left and my right, you see a couple things. One, there's an embedded piece of wood in the stone wall that has holes in it that have pegs sticking out of it originally. Those pegs were for hanging harness and tack. The doorway here was a stable door, and later on you'll be able to see up close, there was a sliding bolt that went across it. We're familiar with Dutch doors where the doors are split in half and you could have the top open for greater ventilation. But you could actually have the entire door open and a sliding bolt would keep the horses from going in or out depending on what you thought was the most appropriate place for them. The other thing about the doors in this barn, which are a little bit nicer than normal, is that the corners are chamfered. So there's no sharp edges where the animals go in and out of the barn. Similarly, the horse side of the barn, because horses are generally taller than cows, the summer beam, which is the beam that supports these heavy floor joists, is again chamfered on this side. So animals wouldn't bang their head, yet on the other side where cows would be, it's not. So again, these things taken into consideration tell you, if you've been to a number of barns, this was the horse side of the barn and the opposite side was the cow side of the barn. And we often would have in early barns these swinging paneled shuttered openings for ventilation as well. They weren't glass until the mid-19th century, so the ones we see, and you'll see later on, were later alterations, as were the holes that were cut into the stable doors to allow glass and allow more light. You know, barns, as you can see, are pretty dark, and if you're in here every day, it's as important to get as much natural illumination as possible because you didn't want to bring lanterns and open flames into a barn. Often you'll actually see right near the door closest to the house a little niche cut into the stone wall, which this barn does not have, where you could set your lantern so you wouldn't have that danger. And in this barn you have a interesting little shelf high up on the corner, again for more storage, showing that this was probably an area of the barn that was most commonly used. The other thing to talk about when you see this, these are hand-hewn beams that run front to back, extend out past the stone wall under what's called the forebay. In order to have a sheltered, protected area, the superstructure of the barn goes out over past in front of the front stone wall and forms a sheltered area. That could be a work area, or it can just be an area to protect you or your animals from inclement weather or even the bright sun. The other thing I like about this barn is if you look carefully, you can see some of the mortise holes in the beams that help show the configuration of the different partitions that may have been here. Basically, you would have doors that come into a feed aisle or into a stable. And depending on where the mortise holes are in the beams, you can almost determine which is which. So that's our tour of the downstairs. There was a ladder or a stairway that led up to the upstairs, but it's not here today, so we will have to go outside and go around to go on the upstairs. So we'll see you up there.
Note the hole in the door frame where you could place a sliding bolt to prevent horses from leaving the barn. Also see the small storage shelf at the top right of the photo.
Here we are standing in what we call a Pennsylvania bank barn. It's called a bank barn because the side to my right was on an earthen embankment, or in this case, a man-made earthen embankment. And so you would come in this end of the barn with your loaded hay wagons. The opposite side of the barn is the front of the barn, and we call the structure over there the forebay, F-O-R-E, so that's the front of the barn. From a use point of view, the Pennsylvania bank barn had stabling on the first floor for animals, mostly horses and cows, and then the second floor would have 2 or 3 separate functions. The central bay that I'm standing in would have been the threshing bay, where you would thresh your grain in the wintertime after it had been stored. The hay would have been stored on either side of the threshing bay in what are called hay mows. They were loose hays, and they were all as high as you can reach. And so the walls behind me used to be solid, just like they are over here, to keep the loose hay from falling through. In the front of the barn, separated from the hay mows, were enclosed areas called granaries, where you would store your grain for the following year. And they were generally attempted to be vermin-proof, rat-proof, mouse-proof, and the like. And as you go through this barn, you will see that the farmer here tried very hard to keep the rats out, and you'll see metal plates, different advertising pieces, different cans, and a 1937 Pennsylvania license plate, all which were used in the effort to keep the rodents from gnawing their way into the granary. Above me, which is hard to see from the shop, but which you can see later, is what's called an overden. Extra sheaves of grain could be stored there. The beams that go across the overden are not solid, they are movable, so that they can be slid front or back depending on the requirements of the time. To get up to the upper level, to get the hay, there were these integral ladders, and at the level of the hay mows, there are footholes cut into them, and above them then there are these runged ladders. This is very interesting in this barn in that the footholes for the ladder are different on this section than they are on that section. The 2 sections of wood, the vertical sections of wood, are called bents, and they are put together through mortise and tenon. A mortise is a slot, a tenon is a piece of wood that goes into the slot. So it's mortise and tenon construction. Because there were no interchangeable parts when you're dealing with hand-hewn beams, as we see throughout this barn, each joint had to be individually done, and they were done on the ground in advance, disassembled, then reassembled on site, or if they're on the ground in front of us, reassembled as they're erected. In order to make sure that the proper joints are done, the posts and the beams each were marked with Roman numerals, which we call marriage marks, that would show the marriage of the joint. In this barn, each of the 2 bents has a different pattern of marriage marks, highlighted by diagonal slashes and little flags or triangle cutouts. So this barn is pretty illustrative of a early to mid 19th century Pennsylvania bank barn. And again, a little bit unusual. Like I said, the footholes are different on this side than they are on behind me, and the marriage marks, and hopefully we'll get a shot of them a little bit later, are slightly different. These are much more deeply cut, thicker, chiseled with properties, and the ones on this side are finer. And whether or not it was a different timber framer on either bed is unknown. So that's one of the little peculiarities that is a question without an answer at this time. I did forget to mention that in the granary, because you wanted some light, that's where the windows are on the outside. So when you come up to an old Pennsylvania bank barn, where you can see the forebay side, which in this case, I'll talk about in a second, the window usually shows that there was an enclosed room, because you don't want to bring an open flame into a hay loft. This makes a lot of sense. The forebay on the Pennsylvania bank barn, often called standard Pennsylvania barn or Pennsylvania standard barn, the barn form, if you look around, you'll see is 3/4 of it is stone, but the forebay side is wood. And that is because it is cantilevered over a sheltered area on the outside of the barn that protected the stable doors. by having that recess, or in some barns the projecting forebay, you can get your doors open whether it was snowing out or whatever the reason. And even in the summer when it was hot, it provided a shaded area. They actually shaded the stables, and so it was a really important workspace. And it is the most important innovation of the Pennsylvania German farm, which is the adaptation of this forebay system, whether projecting out superstructure or a stable wall that is recessed. It was so popular and so useful that both English and Pennsylvania German farmers adopted it very quickly. And most of the barns we see in Bucks County after the second quarter of the 19th century are amalgamation of German ideas and and English ideas. And they're really a Pennsylvania barn or American barn, and they're not English barns or German barns per se. The last thing I want to point out while we're inside, you'll see later, is the fact that in order to provide ventilation into the hay mows, there are big openings cut on either gable end, but instead of earlier barns which may have a ventilation slit, these will have wooden louvers, and those are almost always in the 19th century rather than the 18th century. And finally, I want to point out that this is what we call stone to the square, or stone to the eave level. It's a stone box, and then the triangles formed at the gable ends are wooden. And very typical of Pennsylvania German barns, at the very top of the peak, there was an ornate cutout that would allow birds to fly in and out and allow ventilation to come through. And those were almost always seen in Pennsylvania German barns, where sometimes English barns would have a circle or a diamond shape. But the ornate carved ones are almost always Pennsylvania German. So that's our quick run through of what this West Rockhill, Pennsylvania bank barn is on the upper level. Thank you.
The next two photos show the pronounced overhang or forebay that provided protection from the weather. Note the footholds leading up to the ladder in this photo are cut out by what appears to be an experienced carpenter, while the footholds in this photo are cut out very primitively. As Jeff stated, it appears two different carpenters worked on this barn. The same theory applies to the marriage marks on the left side of the barn that are very shallow, while the marks on the right side are deep and bold. This photo of the Heritage House hangs in the lobby of the West Rockhill Township building.
We're standing inside the farmhouse now, and most Bucks County farmhouses, even the 18th and 19th century ones, went through a lot of generational changes. This one in particular had the unique history of being the police department headquarters, so it has some changes to it that you don't see in your typical Bucks County farmhouse. But the room we're standing in now would have had a cooking fireplace most likely in the location where this fireplace is. And we had cooking fireplaces from the 18th century through the mid-19th century. Behind me to the right, and you'll see it from the outside, are very tall windows, which are usually mid to late 19th century adaptations, because glass was very difficult to come by. From the outside, you'll see that the top of the lintels of these windows have a slight eyebrow shape to them, an elliptical arch. And those are most typically Italianate style features that also date from the mid-19th century. So as we go through the house, we'll point out some of the things that we try to look at to try to figure out what stories can this house tell if you start to look at it, and what may have been changes, what may have been original, and how did this house evolve over its 200-year history. So that's what we'll do.
Here is a photo of a hidden cabinet built under the attic stairwell with an access door located at the top of the staircase leading to the second floor. This is another unique feature of the Heritage House.
Basements are some of the best places to try to understand the history of a house because they're less likely to be changed. There's evidence in the basement of most old houses. To my left, you see a projecting big stone mass, and it goes from the center of the room almost to the end here. You can see a crack where it's been filled in later. This was the support for a large kitchen cooking fireplace, perhaps even what you would call a walk-in fireplace. So this tells us this is the kitchen side of the house. If you spin around over that side, you'll see there's another projecting stone mass, which was the support for a parlor fireplace. By its nature, a parlor fireplace was smaller, and so its mass that supported the hearth and the stonework going up through the attic would be smaller. So that tells us, without even going upstairs, we could say how this house was oriented in its original construction. One of the other things interesting about this house, as you see where my head sticks between them, are that the floor joists are not to mention lumber. They are just flattened logs, and that is also indicative of earlier construction as compared to being sawn lumber, where you would have it later in the 19th century or certainly in the 20th century. So that's what we see in the basement, and the other place we like to show things off is the attic to see if there are any other signs that can tell us the way a house used to be configured. We're up in the attic now, and we'll come back and show you some details later. But I just want to talk about, in brief, what we're looking at up here. On that wall, which is the wall where the cooking fireplace was, where you saw in the basement and on the first floor, we'll show you the fact that there's a new cinder block chimney put in there, but behind it you can see where the soot from the old chimney was that they've taken out. The opposite side, above the parlor fireplace, is much smaller. And didn't need such a big flue because you didn't have a big cooking fireplace, a second floor fireplace, and so you can have a smaller flue on this side. The other thing that's interesting about this attic is the framing system. It is not your typical framing system that you see in later houses and that you see today. Today you would have a framing system where your roof rafters are all the same and they go right across the building, now generally 18 inches to 2 feet apart. This has got what's called a primary rafter system. You have big, heavy beams here and there. You have two of them, and they are connected and tied into each other with these horizontal purlins. Often purlins would rest on top of these big beams, but in this principal rafter system, they are actually they are actually mortise and tenon in them. And because they are not interchangeable parts, because hewn beams are not interchangeable, each one of these joints has marriage marks or Roman numerals carved into them, just as we saw in the barn, so that the right piece goes in the right slot. This is fairly unusual, and it's traditionally an older building technology than we see in the mid to late 19th century. So all this stuff argues that there is an old house in this shell that was modified perhaps in the 1850s when we saw the Italianate features, then certainly again in the 20th century with the police department taking over. But still, if you look carefully, the house can tell you stories about its history. And what we try to do is help people unravel those stories by taking their time, looking at them, and trying to figure out why things are the way they are. And so with that, thank you very much, and hope you enjoyed the tour of the house.
Thank you for joining us on our tour. We would like to thank Jeff Marshall for giving us his time and sharing his expertise in recording the historical features of the Heritage House and Barn. We would also like to thank Joyce Justice for not only taking on the job of program director, but for her time and efforts in filming and editing this program.